The sun was setting over a quiet suburban neighborhood, casting a golden glow over the small, modest home of 95-year-old Margaret Evans. She sat in her cozy armchair by the window, watching as the world outside carried on, as if unaware of the heavy memories she carried in her heart. A World War II veteran, Margaret had lived through battles most could only read about in history books. Her wrinkled hands, decorated with faded scars and liver spots, had once held a rifle in combat, fought for freedom, and cared for wounded soldiers. But now, she faced a different kind of battle, one she never expected at this stage in her life. A gang of bikers had moved into the neighborhood just a few months ago, and ever since, Margaret had become their favorite target. At first, it had been nothing more than loud engines revving at night, disrupting her sleep. Then, it escalated, mocking laughter when she stepped outside, garbage thrown on her lawn, and cruel whispers of old hag whenever she walked past. Margaret was tough. She had been through war, after all. But the relentless torment wore her down, until one day, when they pushed her too far. And that was the day she made a phone call that no one saw coming. The torment begins. Margaret had always been independent. She refused to move into a retirement home, even when her daughter Linda begged her to. "I'm not leaving my house," she'd say stubbornly. "I fought too hard for my freedom to be told where to live." She had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years, watched children grow up, families move in and out, and the seasons change. But she had never encountered anything like the group that had taken over the old abandoned house down the street. They called themselves the Black Reapers, a rough and rowdy biker gang that roared through town, leaving chaos in their wake. To the younger crowd, they were rebellious and exciting. But to Margaret, they were trouble. At first, she ignored them. She stayed inside when they revved their motorcycles, shaking her walls with the deafening sound. She turned the other cheek when they left beer bottles on her sidewalk. But the night they spray-painted vulgar words on her garage door, she'd had enough. The next morning, Margaret took a bucket of soapy water and began scrubbing the red paint off her garage. Her old bones ached, but she refused to let them win. As she scrubbed, laughter echoed from down the street. "Hey, Grandma, need a hand?" one of the bikers called out, his voice dripping with mockery. Margaret straightened her back and turned to face them. There were 5 of them, all dressed in black leather jackets, their arms covered in tattoos. The leader, a towering man with a thick beard and cold eyes, stepped forward. "You know," he said, smirking, "it'd be a shame if something worse happened to your little house." Margaret clenched her jaw. She wasn't afraid of them, not really. But she knew bullies when she saw them, and bullies never stopped on their own. "You boys have nothing better to do than bother an old woman?" she asked, her voice steady despite the anger boiling inside her. The leader chuckled. "You're tough, huh? I like that." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She had faced enemy soldiers, lived through bombings, and held dying friends in her arms. But this was different. This was a slow, cruel war, one she fought alone. That night, they slashed her tires. Margaret woke up the next morning and stepped outside to find her car sagging, the tires flat as pancakes. She stared at the damage, her hands trembling, not from fear, but from rage. For the first time in years, Margaret felt truly powerless. She could handle the taunts, the noise, even the spray paint. But this was different. This was an attack on her ability to be independent. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she turned on her heel, walked into her house, and picked up the phone. With steady hands, she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. A deep voice answered on the other end. "Hello?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Is this Sergeant Thompson?" There was a pause. Then, "Margaret Evans? Is that you?" "It is," she said, "and I need your help." The call that changed everything. Sergeant John Thompson was a man who commanded respect, a retired military officer he had once served alongside Margaret in the war. Now, he ran a veterans motorcycle club, a group of disciplined, honorable men who had traded their uniforms for leather jackets, but never forgot their sense of duty. When Margaret told him what was happening, there was silence on the other end of the line. Then, his voice came through, calm but deadly serious. "We'll take care of it." Margaret wasn't sure what that meant, but something in his tone told her she had just started something big. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air. But this time, it wasn't the Black Reapers. Margaret stepped onto her porch just in time to see them. At least a dozen riders, all wearing leather jackets emblazoned with the emblem of the Iron Brotherhood, a respected veterans motorcycle club. These weren't reckless bikers looking for trouble. These were men who had seen real battle, and they had come for her. John Thompson, a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "Margaret," he said with a warm smile. "It's been a long time." She smiled back. "Too long." He turned to his men and gestured down the street. "Where are they?" Margaret nodded toward the house where the Black Reapers stayed. "Down there." John nodded. "We'll have a talk." Margaret watched as the Iron Brotherhood revved their engines and rode slowly down the street, stopping right in front of the Black Reapers' house. The leader of the Black Reapers stepped outside, clearly taken off guard. "Who the hell are you?" John stepped forward, his stance calm but commanding. "We're the people who don't take kindly to cowards bullying old women." There was a tense silence. Then the leader laughed. "Oh yeah? And what are you gonna do about it, old man?" John didn't answer with words. Instead, he simply took a step closer, and behind him, his men did the same. It was clear, this wasn't going to be a fair fight, and for the first time, the Black Reapers looked nervous. Margaret stood on her porch, watching the scene unfold. For the first time in weeks, she felt safe. But this was only the beginning, because the battle wasn't just about her anymore. It was about standing up to bullies, no matter what form they took, and Margaret Evans was ready for war. The air outside Margaret's home was thick with tension as the two groups faced off. The Black Reapers, a gang of young, reckless troublemakers, and the Iron Brotherhood, a disciplined motorcycle club made up of hardened veterans. John Thompson, standing firm at the front, didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to make the Black Reapers hesitate. "You've been picking on the wrong person," John said, his voice calm but full of authority. "And now you've got a choice. Either you leave this neighborhood and never bother Margaret again, or we handle things the way we used to." The Black Reapers' leader, a man who called himself Viper, narrowed his eyes, clearly weighing his options. "And if we don't?" he challenged, though his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. John took a slow step forward. "Then we settle this now." Behind him, his men adjusted their jackets, some cracking their knuckles. These weren't punks looking for a street fight. These were men who had fought in wars, who had survived real battles, who knew what it meant to stand their ground. Viper took a shaky breath. He had numbers on his side, but something about this group unsettled him. These veterans didn't flinch, didn't posture. They didn't need to. "Fine," Viper muttered, stepping back. "We don't need this place anyway." His men exchanged nervous glances, then followed as he turned toward their motorcycles. Within minutes, the Black Reapers were gone, their engines fading into the night. Margaret, watching from her porch, exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The years had made her strong, but even she had doubted whether she could truly fight this battle alone. John turned back to her, a small smile breaking his otherwise serious expression. "I think your neighborhood is safe again, Margaret." Her lips quivered with emotion as she nodded. "I can't thank you enough, John." "You don't have to," he said. "You've already fought your battles. It's our turn now." A newfound family. The days following the confrontation were the quietest Margaret had known in months. No more revving engines in the dead of night. No more trash littered across her lawn. No more cruel laughter as she walked to her mailbox. But something even more unexpected happened. The Iron Brotherhood didn't just leave after handling the Black Reapers. They started visiting Margaret regularly, checking on her, offering to run errands, and even fixing things around her house. One afternoon, John and a few of his men showed up with paint cans and tools. "We figured we'd repaint your garage," John said, glancing at the faded marks where she had scrubbed the Black Reaper's graffiti. Margaret chuckled. "You boys sure know how to make an old woman feel special." As they worked, she sat on her porch, sipping tea and watching them. It reminded her of the camaraderie she had felt all those years ago in the military. The bond between soldiers never truly faded, no matter how many years passed. The unexpected gift. One evening, Margaret received a knock on her door. When she opened it, she found one of the younger members of the Iron Brotherhood standing there, holding something wrapped in a red cloth. "This is for you," he said with a sheepish smile, handing it over. Margaret unwrapped it carefully, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside was a leather vest, much like the ones the club members wore. But this one was different. It was custom-made for her, with a patch on the back that read, "Honorary Member, Iron Brotherhood." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She ran her fingers over the lettering, her eyes stinging with emotion. I don't know what to say," she whispered. John, who had stepped up behind the young man, smiled warmly. "You're family now, Margaret, and family takes care of each other." She clutched the vest to her chest, overwhelmed by the kindness these men had shown her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. A lasting legacy. Margaret wore her vest proudly, even when she just sat on her porch watching the sunset. The neighborhood, once filled with fear, was peaceful again. People walked their dogs without looking over their shoulders. Children played outside without their parents worrying. And Margaret? She had gained something she never expected at her age, a new family. Years later, when Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 98, the Iron Brotherhood rode in procession at her funeral, their motorcycles forming a protective circle around her gravesite. And on her tombstone, beneath her name and military honors, the words engraved read, "A fighter until the end." Margaret's story became legend in the neighborhood, a story of resilience, courage, and the unexpected bonds that form in the face of adversity. And as long as the Iron Brotherhood rode, Margaret Evans' legacy lived on. The end.